I am Richard Alden, 70 years old, and somehow I am still fighting the bitterest battle of my life, waged by my own blood. As the founder of a $60 million logistics empire, I thought I had built a secure future for my family. Last Tuesday, I drove my son to the airport for a business trip. 10 minutes later, my housekeeper called in a panic with a terrifying warning. "Do not go home. Check the security cameras." I pulled over, opened the mobile app, and watched my own son lead 3 men in medical scrubs straight into my private office. Before I continue, please leave a comment below, letting me know where you are watching this video from, and if you have ever had to stand your ground against family members who underestimated you. Please like and subscribe to support the channel. The morning sun over Los Angeles was blinding, reflecting off an endless sea of cars lined up outside the terminal. My fingers tapped rhythmically against the leather steering wheel as I listened to the low rumble of the engine and the roar of jets taking off into the sky. Sitting next to me was Bradley, my 38-year-old son. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and looked immaculate. In the past few minutes, he had checked his expensive watch for the 3rd time. He was supposed to be flying to Chicago for representing Alden Logistics, the company I built piece by piece with my bare hands over 40 brutal years. I glanced over at him. Bradley had a polished refinement I never possessed. I grew up with grease under my fingernails, unloading cargo ships and fighting for every single dollar, contract, and inch of ground in the supply chain industry. Bradley, on the other hand, grew up in private schools, country clubs, and corner offices with floor-to-ceiling windows. I wanted him to have an easier life than I did. I wanted him to inherit a ready-made empire. But watching him slide his soft, uncalloused thumb across his phone screen, a familiar friction crept into my chest, alongside a quiet thought. Maybe I had made things too easy for him. We pulled up to Terminal 3. I shifted into park and unlocked the doors. Bradley grabbed his leather duffel bag from the back seat. He turned to me, flashing the flawless, professional smile he usually reserved for clients. "Safe travels, son," I said evenly. "Land that Chicago contract. Show them what Alden Logistics can do." "I will, Dad," he replied smoothly. "Don't worry about the business. Take it easy this week and just relax." He stepped out and shut the door firmly. But before walking away, he leaned back down and rested his forearms against the open passenger window. His eyes scanned my face, and that polished smile shifted into something subtly condescending. It was the look an adult gives a toddler who cannot understand simple instructions. "Make sure you lock up tight tonight, Dad," he said, his voice dropping an octave with fake concern. "Your memory hasn't been great lately. You forgot to lock the backyard gate twice this month. I would hate for you to wander off out of confusion." I stared straight at him. My memory was razor sharp. I knew the exact location of every asset, every truck, and every penny in my company at any given second. And I had never forgotten to lock a door. But I did not argue. Over the past few months, I had noticed this new habit of his. These little comments, these subtle jabs designed to make me feel fragile. I chalked it up to his desire to establish dominance, eager to push the old man into a rocking chair so he could finally take complete control. "I will be just fine, Bradley," I said, flatly. "Go catch your flight." He tapped twice on the roof, offered a smug smile, and disappeared into the crowded terminal. I rolled up the window, merged back into the chaotic traffic, and headed toward the 405 freeway. The tension in my shoulders began to ease. A full week without Bradley hovering around the house, and trying to manage my diet, my schedule, and my life sounded like a vacation. I was looking forward to the quiet. Traffic on the 405 was its usual crawling nightmare. I stayed in the fast lane, listening to a jazz station, while watching the concrete sprawl of Los Angeles pass by. I had just passed the Santa Monica exit when the phone in my cup holder buzzed. I ignored it. I had a strict rule about never looking at screens while driving. Then it buzzed again, followed by a continuous stream of vibrations. 3 sharp, aggressive bursts. Frowning, I glanced down at the screen. The notification was from Rosa. Rosa had been my housekeeper for 10 years. She was a quiet, practical woman who took immense pride in taking care of my home. Unless a pipe burst or the alarm system malfunctioned, she would never text me during the day. And she certainly would not message me, frantically, like a panicked teenager. I tapped the preview on the screen. "Mr. Alden, please do not come home." My hands tightened on the wheel. I threw on my blinker, forced my way across 2 lanes of bumper-to-bumper traffic, amidst a chorus of angry horns, and pulled onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched under the tires as I brought the car to a halt. I picked up the phone, my heart pounding heavy and slow. There were 3 messages in total. "Mr. Alden, please do not come home. Pull over somewhere safe right now. Check camera 4. They just fired me and threw me out." I stared at the glowing words. They fired me. Who was they? My wife had passed away years ago. My daughter-in-law, Monica, lived in the estate's guest wing with Bradley, but she had 0 authority over my staff. Rosa answered to me and me alone. And why was Rosa telling me not to return to my own house? A cold, deep-rooted instinct awakened in my chest. The same survival instinct that had saved me from bad business deals and ruthless competitors for decades. Something terrible was happening. My thumb hovered over Rosa's contact to call her, but her instruction stopped me. Check camera 4. Camera 4 was installed in the main hallway of my estate, facing the heavy oak double doors of my private office. That office held my physical ledgers, my primary safe, and the legal deeds to all my properties. No one entered that room without my explicit permission. Not Rosa, not Monica, and not Bradley. I opened the security monitoring app on my phone. The screen went dark for a second, a small loading wheel spinning in the center. I could hear cars rushing past on the freeway, the wind shaking the frame of my car, but my entire focus narrowed to that spinning wheel. The live feed flickered onto the screen. The hallway was brightly lit by morning light streaming through the skylight. At first, it was completely empty. Then, the heavy front door opened. I held my breath. 4 figures walked into the foyer. My eyes immediately locked onto the man leading the group. He wore a tailored navy suit and carried a leather duffel bag. It was Bradley, my son, whom I had watched walk into an airport terminal 30 miles away just 20 minutes ago, was standing in my house. He had never intended to board that plane. The Chicago conference was a lie, and the duffel bag was nothing more than a prop. But it was not that realization that made my blood run cold. It was the 3 men following right behind him. They were heavily built, thick-necked men, wearing light blue medical scrubs. They carried heavy, black canvas bags, the kind used by emergency responders. Through the grainy resolution of the camera, I watched Bradley raise a single finger and point directly at the doors of my private office. The 3 men nodded. One of them unzipped his black bag as he approached the doors and pulled something out. It was a heavy canvas restraint jacket with long straps, a piece of high-grade medical restraint equipment. Another man reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin metal object that glinted in the hallway light. A medical syringe. Bradley stood aside, arms crossed over his chest, his face entirely expressionless as he watched the men push open my office doors and step aside. He looked calm, calculating, and patient. He was waiting for something. He was waiting for me to come home. The weight of what I was witnessing hit me like a physical blow. The fake business trip. The condescending remarks about my memory, the sudden firing of my loyal housekeeper to clear out any witnesses. My own son had set a trap in my living room, intending to ambush me with hired men carrying sedatives and restraints. I sat alone in my car on the freeway shoulder, surrounded by a deafening silence. I did not panic, and I did not cry. The initial shock burned away instantly, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp clarity. They thought I was a confused, defenseless old man, whose mind was fading. They thought they could cage a wolf in his own den. I locked my phone screen, set it carefully on the passenger seat, and gripped the steering wheel tight. Taking a slow, deep breath, I prepared to dismantle my son's life completely. I picked up my phone again and slid my thumb across the glass. I needed to test the waters. Before taking my next move, I had to know just how deep this deception went. I dialed Bradley's number. It rang twice before he answered. Instantly, a wall of ambient noise spilled through the speaker. A muffled broadcast about flight delays, the hum of crowd chatter, and the rhythmic clicking of luggage wheels rolling across tile floors. It was a flawless background audio track. "Hey, Dad," Bradley said, his voice raised slightly, as if trying to speak over the airport system. "Did you make it back home?" I stared at the monitor feed on my dashboard. Bradley was standing in the middle of my quiet, sunlit office, holding his phone tightly against his ear. "Not yet," I replied, forcing my voice to sound like a tired old man navigating Los Angeles traffic. I pulled over to grab a cup of coffee. "Just wanted to make sure you got through security all right. The lines looked long when I dropped you off." "Oh, it was a nightmare," Bradley lied smoothly, pacing across my vintage Persian rug. "But I made it through. I'm sitting at gate 12 now. They should start boarding in about 10 minutes. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. The boy I had raised, the son I had trusted to inherit my life's work, was looking at my mahogany desk while effortlessly painting a vivid picture of an airport terminal 30 miles away. "That's good," I said. "Have a safe flight. Call me when you land in Chicago." "Will do, Dad. Get some rest today." The line went dead. I put the phone down. A heavy, suffocating chill settled deep into my bones. He had prepared a soundboard. This was not a sudden lapse in judgment. This was a highly coordinated, meticulously planned operation. And if Bradley was the actor on stage, someone else was writing the script. Bradley was too weak and impulsive to engineer something this seamless. He lacked the backbone to coordinate an ambush on his own. I needed to speak to the director of this little production. I dialed Monica's number. My daughter-in-law had always been a master of appearances. From the moment Bradley brought her home, she played the role of the devoted, caring family member. She was always the first to pour my tea, the first to ask about my doctor's appointments, and the first to suggest I step back from company affairs to enjoy my golden years. I had mistaken her constant hovering for genuine affection. Now I saw it for what it truly was: tactical reconnaissance. It rang 3 full times before she picked up. "Dad." Monica's voice was bright, sweet, and perfectly calm. "I'm so glad you called. Are you on your way back?" "Still stuck on the freeway," I lied, leaning back against the leather seat. "Traffic stopped completely past Culver City. I just wanted to check in. I spoke to Bradley a moment ago. He's at his gate." "Yes. He just texted me," Monica replied effortlessly. Her tone was light and airy, the picture of a supportive wife. "Listen, Dad. Don't be alarmed when you get home. I had to make an emergency decision while you were out driving." "An emergency decision?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "I noticed a water stain on the ceiling under your main bathroom this morning," she explained, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I didn't want to risk a pipe bursting while you were home alone, so I called an emergency plumbing crew. They're inside right now checking the lines." The sheer, cold composure in her voice was chilling. She was fabricating a cover story for the men inside the house, just in case I arrived earlier than expected and saw unfamiliar vehicles in the driveway. She was ensuring that when I walked through the front door, I would be completely off guard, believing I was being greeted by a crew of workers fixing a leak. "I see," I said, keeping my breathing slow and steady. "That was very thoughtful of you, Monica. I appreciate you taking care of it. Will they be there long?" "They should be wrapping up soon," she assured me. "I told them to lock up when they leave if you aren't back yet. I also set up the coffee maker for you. I know how much you dislike setting that thing up. Just press the button when you walk in." "You always think of everything," I whispered. "We just want you to be comfortable, Dad. Drive safe." She hung up. I sat in the warm car interior, staring at the screen. Plumbers, a bathroom leak, and a fresh pot of coffee waiting for me. Their sheer arrogance was astounding. They had charted every detail of my daily routine, anticipated my reactions, and treated me like a predictable aging asset ready to be liquidated. They thought they had calculated every variable, but they forgot that before they were even born, I had spent 40 years predicting supply chain disruptions. I picked up my phone, reopened the security app, and pulled up the live feed from camera 4. I maximized the screen, pinching the glass to zoom in on the office. The 3 men were still standing there, taking instructions from my son. My son, I observed, Monica's supposed emergency plumbers. I looked at their hands. I looked at the black canvas bags sitting on the floor. There were no pipe wrenches, no wire cutters, no sealant tape, and no toolboxes. One of the men, a large figure with thick arms and a shaved head, reached into his bag, pulled out the heavy leather restraint jacket, and tested the strength of the buckles. The second man stood near the bookshelf, quietly preparing a medical syringe, tapping the glass vial with a thick finger to clear the air bubbles. They were not there to fix a leak. They were an extraction team. My focus shifted to Bradley. He stood at my desk, the very desk where I had spent countless late nights, building the wealth he was so desperate to inherit. He unzipped his leather duffel bag, reached inside, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He spread them flat across the mahogany surface, smoothing them down with his palm. The camera's resolution was clear enough for me to read the emblem printed on the top page. It was the official red seal of the California Superior Court. This was their true end game, humanness. They weren't just trying to steal my money behind my back. They were going to strip away my basic human rights. They planned to have me declared mentally incompetent, seizing absolute legal control over my life, my assets, and my freedom. I would be locked away, entirely dependent on the very two people who had constructed the cage. The game was officially on. The panic that should have paralyzed me was instantly replaced by a familiar, calculating resolve. When you spend 4 decades building a $60 million supply chain empire from a single delivery truck, you learn one lesson early on. Emotion is a liability. Panic does not pay payroll. Fear does not optimize shipping routes. And anger does not negotiate favorable port duties. In my world, when a crisis hits, you do not freeze. You analyze the variables. You identify the point of failure. Then, you execute a solution with absolute, cold precision. I leaned back, ignoring the traffic roaring past my window. I closed my eyes, letting my mind strip away the illusion of my peaceful home life. I needed to audit the raw data from the past 6 months. The scattered, confusing pieces of the puzzle began fitting together with horrifying clarity. It all started in late autumn. I had always been an early riser, the kind of man who arrived at the warehouse at 5 in the morning, sharp and ready for the day. But around November, a strange, heavy exhaustion began trapping me in bed. My limbs felt heavy, as if filled with wet sand. I would wake up with a dull ache at the base of my skull, accompanied by a thick fog that clouded my thoughts. I visited my longtime personal physician, who gently suggested that at 70 years old, my body was simply asking me to slow down. I believed him. I accepted it as the natural decline at all. But it wasn't natural decline at all. I remembered the humiliating incident with my car keys last month. I had left them on the kitchen counter, the exact spot where I had placed them every day for 15 years. An hour later, they were gone. I spent 45 minutes frantically searching the entire house. It was Monica who eventually found them, magically hidden inside a milk carton in the refrigerator. She had looked at me with overwhelming pity, placing a soft hand on my shoulder, whispering that memory lapses were completely normal at my age. Bradley had stood in the doorway, shaking his head with a heavy, dramatic sigh. The entire event was a setup, a deliberate move to make me doubt my own sanity. And then there was the coffee. Monica had been so adamant about taking over my morning routine. She claimed she had found a specialty organic roast at a downtown boutique and insisted on brewing it for me every morning, as a gesture of gratitude for everything I had provided. Every morning, she would walk into my study carrying a steaming ceramic mug, lingering long enough to watch me take the first few sips. And every morning, within 30 minutes of finishing that coffee, that heavy, suffocating brain fog would set in. I would struggle to read my financial reports, watching the numbers on the spreadsheets blur and swim across the page. A subtle, uncontrollable tremor would creep into my hands. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being systematically and deliberately poisoned. The realization hit me like a freight train. But I kept my breathing steady. They were drugging me. They were using some form of chemical sedative, carefully controlling the dosage to mimic the symptoms of severe cognitive decline, yet keeping it low enough to avoid sending me to the hospital, where blood tests would expose their betrayal. They needed a paper trail of my supposed deterioration. They needed a documented history of confusion, that lethargy, and memory loss. That was the only way a judge would grant an emergency conservatorship. They needed me to look like a helpless, broken old man who could no longer manage a vast business empire. I opened my eyes and stared through the windshield at the endless stream of traffic, the medical scrubs, the heavy leather restraint jacket, the syringe. It all made complete and sickening sense now. The men in my house were not plumbers. They were an extraction team. Bradley and Monica were waiting for me to return home. Monica would hand me a fresh cup of coffee, likely spiked with a heavy, paralyzing dose of the same chemical they had been feeding me. Once I collapsed, the men in scrubs would subdue me. They would use those court documents to forcibly transfer me to a private, high-security facility. Once locked away behind iron gates, heavily medicated and cut off from the outside world, Bradley would assume total legal control over Alden Logistics. He would have unrestricted access to my bank accounts, my property deeds, and my investment portfolio. He would liquidate my life's work while I slowly wasted away in a padded room, unable to contact my lawyers or access my funds. It was a cold, corporate takeover, executed right inside my own home. I reached out and picked up my phone from the passenger seat. I needed to act, but I had to do it without raising any alarms. In the logistics industry, tracking your assets is the difference between quarterly profits and bankruptcy. Every truck in my commercial fleet was equipped with a stated satellite tracking system, and I applied that same principle to my personal vehicles. I opened the fleet management app onto my phone and pulled up the diagnostic data for my car. The primary GPS signal was operating normally, placing my location right on the shoulder of the 405. But as I scrolled through the raw diagnostic data, my eyes caught a secondary frequency, a faint parasitic signal hopping between cell towers, transmitting a parallel set of location data every 30 seconds. My vehicle's internal computer system had detected an unauthorized external device, drawing power from the battery. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out into the loud freeway traffic. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders as I knelt on the hot asphalt. Reaching under the front bumper, I felt along the metal chassis, blindly searching past the plastic guard and steering column joints. My fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. It was a small, rectangular plastic box, roughly the size of a deck of cards, held firmly in place by a heavy-duty magnetic base. I pulled it free and brought it into the light. It was a commercial-grade, long-life tracking beacon. A small green light blinked on its face, indicating it was actively transmitting. Bradley hadn't just set an ambush at the house. He was monitoring my exact movements in real time. They knew precisely where I was, and they were watching to see what I would do next. The trap was set, and the orchestrators were watching my every move. I placed the tracking beacon back under the bumper, ensuring the magnet clicked securely against the chassis. If I destroyed the device, Bradley would know I was onto them. I needed him to believe I was aimlessly driving around Los Angeles, completely oblivious. I slid back into the driver's seat, shifted into gear, and merged into traffic. I took the very next exit, navigating local streets, until I found a crowded outdoor shopping center. Weaving through the maze of parked vehicles, I parked the car in a shaded corner on the third floor of a parking garage. I turned off the engine and locked the doors. My car, along with the attached tracker, would sit quietly here, continuing to send a mundane stationary location to my son's phone. Walking down the stairs to the street, I flagged down a taxi and gave the driver an address. A rundown fast food restaurant on the edge of town. A place completely disconnected from the polished world Bradley and Monica inhabited. I sat in the back seat watching the gleaming high-rises slowly fade into dingy storefronts and budget motels. When the taxi pulled into the parking lot, I paid the driver in cash and stepped out into the stale air. The lot was nearly empty. I walked over to a weathered wooden bench near the back entrance and sat down to wait. 10 minutes later, a faded blue sedan turned off the main road, its tires crunching over gravel before pulling into a space a few yards away. The engine coughed twice and cut off. Mainquo. The driver's side door opened, and Rosa stepped out. She looked entirely different from the poised housekeeper who had managed my estate for a decade. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands trembled, and her eyes darted nervously. Clutching a leather handbag tightly against her chest, she walked quickly toward the bench. I stood up to meet her, but she raised a trembling hand, motioning for me to stay seated. "Mr. Alden," she whispered, her voice filled with panic. "I am so sorry. I didn't know who else to call. I had to warn you." "Take a deep breath, Rosa," I said quietly. "You did the right thing. Tell me what happened after I left this morning." Rosa swallowed hard, gripping her handbag tighter. "Right after you drove away, Miss Monica walked into the kitchen. She told me my services were no longer needed. She handed me a severance check and told me I had 20 minutes to pack my things and leave. She watched me the entire time, but I saw the men arrive. They didn't look like plumbers. They looked dangerous." "I know," I replied calmly. "They are an extraction crew. They are waiting for me to return so they can lock me away." Rosa gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her bag. "I knew something terrible was happening," she whispered. "Miss Monica has been acting strange for months, always locking her guest room door, always watching you eat. Last night she asked me to empty the trash in her bathroom. I noticed something at the bottom of the bin. She tried to bury it under paper towels, but I saw it and pulled it out." Rosa pulled her hand from the bag, holding 2 items. The first was a prepaid burner phone. The second was an amber plastic prescription bottle. The label had been scraped off, leaving only sticky paper residue and glue behind. "I bought this phone with cash," Rosa explained, handing both items to me. "I was worried your main phone might be monitored. But you need to look at these pills. I saw her last week. She thought I was vacuuming the hallway, but I saw her in the kitchen. She used a metal spoon to crush one of these tablets into a fine white powder, then stirred it straight into your morning coffee. She has been drugging you." I took the bottle from her trembling hand, the plastic rattling softly as I turned it over. I could see several white, chalky pills lying at the bottom. The heavy truth of the past 6 months settled into my palm. The brain fog, the fatigue, the memory lapses. It had all been meticulously administered by the woman who smiled at me every morning. "Thank you, Rosa," I said, looking her in the eyes. "You saved my life. I need you to get out of the city. Take that severance check, cash it immediately, and stay at your sister's house for a few days. Do not answer any calls from my son or daughter-in-law. I will contact you when it is safe." She nodded rapidly, tears welling in the corners of her eyes. "Please be careful, Mr. Alden. They are planning something awful." "I know," I told her, "but they have severely underestimated who they are dealing with." I watched Rosa hurry back to her car. She started the engine, backed out, and drove off, disappearing down the road. I was alone again, sitting back down on the weathered bench. I held the burner phone in one hand and the pill bottle in the other. I needed to know exactly what weapon they were using against me. I twisted off the plastic cap and carefully tipped one of the small white pills into my hand. Without a prescription label, the medication was anonymous, but pharmaceutical companies leave unique fingerprints. Holding the pill up to the sunlight, I squinted to read the tiny alphanumeric code stamped into the compressed powder. I picked up the prepaid burner phone and opened the web browser, typing the code into a medical database. I clicked search and watched the progress bar crawl across the top of the screen. The database results popped up instantly, displaying a high-resolution image of the exact pill sitting in my hand. As I read the chemical breakdown, the stark reality of their betrayal lit up the screen. It was haloperidol, a potent antipsychotic medication typically used in high-security psychiatric facilities to manage severe conditions and acute delirium. Its side effects included extreme lethargy, cognitive impairment, memory loss, and loss of motor function. Monica had been feeding me concentrated doses of a chemical straitjacket. I scrolled down, reading the standard prescription protocols. The medication was strictly controlled and impossible to obtain legally without a thorough diagnostic evaluation. I needed to find out who had supplied this weapon. Raising the amber bottle once more, I examined the torn remnants of the paper label. Most of the identifying information had been destroyed, but Monica had been careless along the bottom edge. A tiny strip of white paper remained stubbornly glued to the plastic. I turned the bottle, catching the light, and there in minuscule black ink, the prescribing doctor's name was barely legible. Dr. Gregory Pierce. I slipped the amber bottle and the burner phone into my pocket and walked away from the weathered bench. The warm afternoon air felt heavy in my lungs, but my mind had never been sharper. I walked to the edge of the parking lot and hailed a passing taxi, deliberately avoiding rideshare apps to prevent leaving a digital footprint tied to my main device. I instructed the driver to take me to an industrial area on the outskirts of Long Beach. I needed a medical facility that operated completely outside the standard corporate healthcare network. One that offered absolute discretion and unquestionable loyalty. My destination was a private medical clinic run by David Marshall, a former military doctor I had served with decades ago. When commercial banks denied him a business loan, I funded his clinic myself. He owed his entire career to me. His practice operated in a quiet space, catering strictly to high-net-worth clients who required absolute anonymity. As the taxi navigated the crowded streets, I stared out the window. My own son, my seemingly perfect daughter-in-law. They weren't just trying to steal my hard-earned wealth. They were slowly and systematically erasing my existence. This betrayal ran far deeper than simple greed. It was a cold, calculated hit on my life and dignity. The taxi pulled up to an understated brick building, tucked safely between two massive shipping warehouses. I paid the driver in cash and stepped out into the humid coastal air. Pushing open the heavy glass doors, I walked past the empty waiting room and straight into the secure, clinical wing. The receptionist stood up to voice a protest, but David emerged from a nearby exam room. He was a tall, rugged man with a thick gray beard and sharp eyes. Recognizing the cold urgency in my expression, he waved off the receptionist immediately. We stepped into his private back office, and I firmly locked the door behind us. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the amber pill bottle, and set it directly on his stainless steel desk. Skipping the pleasantries, I told him I needed a comprehensive, expedited toxicology screening and that it had to remain completely off any official medical records. David looked deeply at the bottle, reading the scraped label with a heavy frown. Asking no unnecessary questions, he silently guided me to a leather exam chair, wrapped a rubber tourniquet around my bicep, and skillfully slid a needle into my vein. I watched the dark red liquid flow steadily into the glass tubes, knowing those blood samples contained indisputable proof of a horrifying betrayal. Once 3 separate vials were filled, he assured me that using his advanced in-house lab equipment, he would have definitive results in less than an hour. With a small bandage secured on my arm, I was left entirely alone in the quiet office. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the prepaid burner phone Rosa had provided. It was time to release the hounds. I dialed the unlisted private number of Thomas Kensington, my chief corporate attorney. Thomas was a man with a sharp, relentless legal mind. For 30 years, he had aggressively protected Alden Logistics from hostile takeovers, industrial espionage, and predatory lawsuits. He answered on the very first ring. I bypassed standard greetings, informing him I was calling from a secure, untraceable line because my personal devices were likely compromised. Thomas shifted instantly into battle mode, his tone dropping to a low, focused pitch. With absolute composure, I laid out the situation. I explained the fake business trip to Chicago, the 3 men in medical scrubs waiting at my home, the heavy leather restraint jacket, the fabricated court documents, and the slow, deliberate chemical poisoning. I heard a sharp intake of breath over the line. Thomas had known Bradley since he was a young boy, but in the brutal world of high-stakes logistics, sentimentality was a fatal defect. I gave Thomas immediate, non-negotiable orders. Initiate a top-level lockdown protocol on every financial and physical asset in my name. I wanted all my private bank accounts frozen, my real estate deeds locked securely inside a blind holding trust, and my stock portfolio halted from any external trades. I explicitly instructed him to build an impenetrable legal fortress around my $60 million empire. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomas assured me that within 60 minutes, any desperate attempt by Bradley to access my wealth, execute a fraudulent power of attorney, or leverage my business assets would trigger a massive automated legal shutdown. The trap was closing. I thanked Thomas, feeling a cold satisfaction replace the lingering heartbreak. Ending the call, I tossed the cheap burner phone onto the desk. The defense was firmly set. Now I just needed to confirm the exact nature of the poison in my veins. Time dragged by in an agonizingly slow rhythm. I paced the small, sterile office, the leather soles of my shoes clicking against the polished linoleum. I thought of Monica's sweet smile as she handed me that poisoned morning coffee, and of Bradley standing confidently in my private study, eager to steal my life's work. Finally, the heavy wooden door clicked open. David walked slowly back into the room, gripping a freshly printed lab report in his wide hands. His face had noticeably drawn, long, his skin pale, and his jaw set so tight, the muscles twitched beneath his beard. He didn't look at me with the calm detachment of an experienced physician. He looked at me with the deep, fearful concern of a soldier who had just witnessed a brutal, deliberate atrocity. Placing the printed document on the stainless steel desk, he let out a long, trembling breath and met my gaze. The blood work confirmed everything, but the reality was far more vicious than I had anticipated. David pointed out that my blood contained massive concentrations of a potent antipsychotic. The deliberate dosages they had been feeding me were catastrophic. Leaning in, his voice a mix of professional shock and personal outrage. He told me that if I had continued taking those pills for even one more week, the cumulative chemical toxicity in my brain would have triggered a permanent, irreversible coma. The execution date had already been set. I nodded silently to thank David, then stepped out of the clinic. The muggy coastal heat hit me instantly, but the cold reality of my situation kept my mind razor sharp. I didn't bother looking back at the brick building. Walking 2 blocks down the road, I hailed a passing taxi. I told the driver to take me to the financial district in downtown Los Angeles, but gave him an intersection 2 blocks away from my actual destination. I couldn't risk leaving a direct trail. The drive took 40 minutes. Every second was spent staring out the window at the passing city. I thought about the logistics empire I had built from a single rusty truck, and the thousands of employees who relied on my company to feed their families. Bradley wasn't just threatening my life. He was threatening the livelihoods of everyone under my corporate umbrella. The cab pulled up to a busy intersection. Handing the driver a fresh $50 bill, I stepped onto the crowded sidewalk. Moving briskly, I blended into the afternoon crowd of corporate workers and tourists, navigating familiar streets until I reached a narrow, shadowed service alley directly behind a grand glass and steel skyscraper. This was the headquarters of Kensington and Partners. Bypassing the main lobby entirely, I walked down the dim alley to an unmarked heavy steel service door. Reaching out, I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner hidden beneath a weatherproof cover. The locking mechanism clicked open immediately, recognizing my print. I stepped into a quiet service corridor and took a private elevator straight to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the vast, quiet space of Thomas Kensington's private office suite. Thomas was already standing behind his massive oak desk, sleeves rolled up and tie loosened, looking like a general preparing for a brutal siege. 3 of his top forensic accountants sat at a long conference table, surrounded by glowing monitors and thick stacks of printouts. They didn't even look up as I walked in. Their eyes locked onto the rolling data of my life's work. Thomas walked over and gripped my hand tightly. He didn't waste time asking how I felt about the poison in my blood. He knew my focus was entirely on the counterstrike. I asked him what his team had found on the corporate servers. Guiding me to the head of the conference table, Thomas explained that initiating the financial lockdown had triggered automated security protocols across the network. Bradley had been using his executive access to systematically dismantle the financial safeguards I spent decades putting in place. Thomas had instructed his chief accountant to run a covert forensic audit, an advanced tracking protocol designed to bypass standard corporate firewalls without alerting the main administrator. We needed to see how deep the corruption went without tipping off Bradley. The accountant typed a rapid sequence of commands into his keyboard, and the massive display screen on the wall lit up. Columns of raw financial data began cascading down the monitor, illuminating the darkened room in a pale blue glow. I stood motionless, watching the digital lifeblood of Alden Logistics flash before my eyes. For the first 20 minutes, the ledgers looked completely normal. Operating expenses, payroll distributions, fuel costs, and routine maintenance budgets aligned perfectly with my internal projections. Bradley had been careful, hiding his illicit activity deep under layers of legitimate corporate transactions. However, the forensic audit was designed to uncover the invisible cracks in the foundation. The chief accountant suddenly paused the scrolling data, highlighting a complex network of recent real estate transactions. My chest tightened as I read the corporate names on the screen. Bradley hadn't just embezzled liquid cash from operating accounts. Using the forged executive authorizations Monica helped him secure, he had committed a far more devastating financial crime. He had secretly mortgaged 4 of my largest distribution warehouse houses as a collateral. Our primary shipping hubs in Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and Seattle. They were the physical pillars holding up my entire national supply chain. Bradley had quietly transferred the property titles under a newly formed subsidiary holding company, then used those titles to secure massive, unregulated commercial loans from private shadow lenders. He was mortgaging the concrete and steel of my legacy to fund his desperate agenda. Thomas let out a low, angry sigh. See it. He explained that these loans were structured with predatory interest rates and hidden default clauses. If this massive debt wasn't cleared, the private lenders would legally seize the warehouses, crippling Alden Logistics' operational capacity overnight. I instructed the forensic accountant to trace exactly where the borrowed funds had gone. I needed to know who held the leash on my son and his wife. The accountant initiated a deep web tracing sequence, following the digital money trail through a dizzying maze of offshore accounts and blind trusts. The funds hopped from the Cayman Islands to Panama, finally landing on a remote banking server somewhere in the Caribbean. This digital laundering technique was sophisticated, proving clearly that Bradley wasn't acting alone. He was being guided by highly trained individuals who specialized in making massive illegal fortunes disappear without a trace. The tracking software finally isolated the terminal destination of the transferred funds. The chief accountant stopped typing and slowly looked up at Thomas. The spacious room fell into absolute silence. Thomas placed his hands flat on the conference table, leaning heavily over the wooden surface, staring at the screen for a long, painful minute. Then he reached out his right arm and turned the large display monitor so it faced me directly. I examined the highlighted destination carefully. The money had been wired straight into a massive shell company based out of Miami. I recognized the corporate entity instantly. It was a well-known financial front for an international criminal syndicate. Bradley hadn't just stolen money behind his family's back. He had stupidly crawled into bed with a dangerous cartel. Thomas looked at me with cold eyes, pointing his finger at the digital ledger on the display. He explained that my son had borrowed $15 million from this powerful organization. His finger slid down to a subdocument detailing aggressive repayment terms. The brutal reality of the situation hung heavily in the room. Bradley hadn't just stolen company funds. He owed the cartel $15 million, and the deadline for full repayment was strictly set in just 48 hours. This massive debt completely extinguished any lingering paternal warmth I had left. Bradley was a desperate animal backed into a corner, clawing frantically to save his own life, and entirely prepared to sacrifice mine. I left Thomas in his office with strict instructions to maintain radio silence, then took a cab back to the shopping center where I had left my car. I found my sedan sitting exactly where I had parked it, the tracking beacon still attached to the chassis, silently broadcasting my location to my executioners. Sliding into the leather driver's seat, I gripped the steering wheel and took a long, slow, controlled breath. The phase of quietly gathering actionable intelligence was over. Now it was time to step directly into the jaws of the elaborate trap they had set for me. Shifting smoothly into gear, I began the quiet drive back to my estate. During that drive, I systematically stripped away the sharp, authoritative posture of a successful CEO. I let my broad shoulders slump weakly forward, curving my spine to mimic the heavy weight of old age. I practiced softening my sharp gaze, replacing my calculating focus with a dull, wandering stare. I had to perfectly embody the frail, broken man they so desperately needed me to be. The helpless victim. Just before turning into my quiet private street, I reached over to open the glove compartment and pulled out a flat, polished stainless steel flask. Unscrewing the cap, I poured the remaining aged whiskey out the open window, then slipped the empty flask into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Turning the wheel slowly, I guided the sedan down the long, landscaped driveway of my estate. The property was disturbingly quiet. The fake emergency plumbing vehicles Monica had mentioned were completely gone from the circular driveway. They had deliberately moved the work vans into the spacious closed garage to maintain the deceptive illusion of a serene, empty house. I parked near the main entrance, turned off the engine, and took one last deep breath. Letting my jaw relax slightly, I opened the heavy door and stepped out, deliberately dragging the heels of my leather shoes loudly across the decorative pavers. I shuffled awkwardly up the stone path, making my movements appear slow and laborious. Reaching the heavy oak front door, I fumbled awkwardly with the house keys, intentionally dropping the entire loud ring onto the welcome mat. Bending down agonizingly slow, I let out a loud groan of exhaustion before finally unlocking the door and pushing it open. The grand foyer was bathed in the warm golden light of late afternoon, but the silence inside felt thick and suffocating, charged with a predatory tension. I stepped awkwardly into the quiet house, leaving my expensive leather briefcase abandoned on the marble floor. I rubbed my temples forcefully, pretending to fight off a sudden wave of confusion. Right on cue, the sharp click of designer heels echoed down the adjacent hallway. Monica appeared, wearing a soft pastel cardigan, a look of fake devotion crafted on her face. Her large eyes widened with practiced concern as she rushed across the marble floor to greet me. "Richard," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You're home, so late. We were starting to get so worried about you." She reached out quickly, taking my right arm. Her touch, which I once found comforting, felt like the cold grip of a viper. "Traffic was terrible," I muttered, slurring my words slightly and letting my head drop toward my chest. "I feel so tired, Monica. Unbelievably tired. My head is spinning again. I just can't shake this brain fog today." "Oh, poor Dad," she cooed, stroking my arm with maternal condescension. "You've been pushing yourself way too hard lately." The plumbers just finished packing up their gear. I had Bradley wait in the guest wing so the house would be quiet for you. "Come sit down in the living room. Let me get you something warm to drink." I allowed her to guide me to the leather armchair, sinking into the cushions with a weary sigh. Monica hovered over me, her eyes darting quickly to evaluate my alertness before sliding away toward the kitchen. I sat motionless, listening to the quiet clatter of porcelain. She was preparing the painful dose to incapacitate me, so the extraction team could put me in the restraint jacket. She returned carrying a silver tray with a steaming porcelain teacup, setting it on the coffee table before picking up the cup. "I brewed a special chamomile blend for you," she whispered, smiling sweetly. "It will help clear that brain fog. Drink it while it's hot, Richard." I reached out with trembling hands to accept the cup. Beneath the scent of chamomile, I caught a faint, bitter chemical undertone. Haloperidol. It was a massive dose meant to completely paralyze me. "Thank you, Monica," I rasped, bringing the cup close to my lips. Just before the liquid touched my mouth, a loud, sharp knock echoed at the heavy front door. Monica froze, a flash of genuine panic breaking through her carefully crafted disguise. She hadn't expected to be interrupted. No one was supposed to be knocking. "I'll be right back," she hissed softly. "Drink your tea." She strode quickly toward the entryway. The moment her back was turned, my trembling hands became rock steady. Reaching into my jacket pocket, I pulled out the stainless steel flask, unscrewed the cap, and poured the hot, drugged tea straight into the metal container. Tucking the flask back into my jacket, I set the empty cup back on the tray. I waited exactly 10 seconds. Letting out a loud groan, I threw my weight to one side, knocking the silver tray off the table. It slammed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. Monica came rushing back into the room, finding me slumped dangerously sideways in the armchair, my eyes rolling back. "Richard!" she gasped, triumphant. A triumphant, predatory smile forming on her lips. She grabbed my shoulders tightly. "Let me help you, Richard. Let me get you to the bedroom." Her grip was surprisingly strong as she hauled me up from the armchair, her breathing heavy with frantic urgency. I let my legs drag on the floor, playing the role of a heavily sedated, failing old man. Groaning incoherently, I let my chin drop to my chest while she dragged me down the dim hallway toward the master bedroom. She pushed me onto the mattress, not bothering to take off my shoes or unroll the silk sheets. I let my body collapse like a pile of lifeless mud. Monica stood over me for a long, painful minute. I kept my breathing faint, my eyes half closed, waiting in the silence. Finally, I heard a sharp, satisfied exhale slip through her lips. Turning off the bedside lamp, she stepped out of the room and pulled the heavy door shut. A firm metal click echoed in the dark. She had locked me in from the outside. I lay motionless in the pitch-black room for 2 full hours. As night fell over Los Angeles, the ambient sounds of the estate shifted. The distant roar of the freeway faded into a quiet whisper. At 8 o'clock sharp, the crunch of tires on gravel signaled an arrival. The front door opened and closed, and I heard Bradley's deep baritone echoing up from the kitchen, directly below my room. Bradley was back. He was likely confirming the extraction plan with Monica, coordinating the final steps with the medical crew waiting in the garage. They believed they had neutralized their main obstacle, assuming I was floating in a deep chemical void while my empire was stolen out from under me. I opened my eyes. It was dark, but I didn't need light to navigate the house I built. Every creaking floorboard, every quirk of the structure, and every hidden detail was mapped in my mind. Sitting up smoothly, my head was sharp and completely clear of the drugs they thought they had administered. I slipped off my shoes, placing them softly on the rug, and walked silently toward the master bathroom, avoiding the locked bedroom door entirely. When we renovated the estate 10 years ago, I insisted on installing a hidden secondary escape route from the master suite to the lower level. A paranoid but practical security for a man in my position. Pushing open a concealed panel behind the large linen closet, I stepped into a narrow service corridor. Descending the steep wooden stairs in total silence, I moved like a ghost through the walls of my own home. Passing the kitchen, the muffled murmur of Bradley and his wife talking echoed softly through the floorboards. Moving with cold precision, I slipped seamlessly into the west wing of the estate, which housed private family offices. Bypassing my own secured study, I walked straight toward the modern, glass-walled office Bradley had taken over. The door was shut but unlocked. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The room smelled of expensive cologne and anxiety. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking the moonlight. I walked behind his mahogany desk. Bradley was arrogant, but he was also careless. relying too heavily on the illusion of security in a gated community and the false loyalty of his co-conspirator. Resting right in the center of the desk, plugged into a sleek charging dock, was his personal tablet. The screen was dark, but a small green indicator light pulsed softly. Reaching out, I tapped the glass. The screen lit up, illuminating the room in a pale blue glow. Bradley hadn't even bothered to set a passcode or biometric lock. He was so confident in his control over the family that he left the device completely exposed. Swiping up, I bypassed the lock screen and entered the main dashboard. I opened his primary document app and scanned the recent files, my eyes locking onto a folder labeled with my full legal name. Opening the folder, I clicked on the first document in the queue. The screen immediately filled with dense legal text, stamped with the official seal of the California Superior Court. It was a complete petition for emergency medical conservatorship. The language was cold, detached, and devastating, falsely claiming I had suffered a catastrophic, unrecoverable cognitive breakdown. It cited fabricated medical evaluations, forged diagnostic reports, and manipulated testimony from my own family. The documents legally framed me as incapacitated, entirely incapable of making rational decisions, and completely dependent on continuous psychiatric care. The final page contained a terrifying timeline. The emergency Judah executed was scheduled to be officially executed and legally approved tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. In less than 12 hours, the extraction team hidden in my garage, would strap me into a leather restraint jacket and transport me to an undisclosed, high-security facility. Bradley would then gain absolute, unrestricted legal authority over Alden Logistics and my $60 million fortune. The perfect legal execution of my identity had been coordinated flawlessly. I quickly reached into the inner pocket of my jacket, pulled out a small, high-capacity encrypted flash drive, plugged it straight into the tablet's side port, and initiated a rapid, silent transfer of the entire document folder. I needed to safely store every forged signature and falsified medical report as indisputable physical evidence. A CN's instances. As the blue progress bar crawled across the glowing screen, my eyes scanned the other applications installed on the tablet. Hidden in the corner of the digital display, disguised as a common icon resembling a simple weather app, was a highly secure, heavily encrypted messaging platform. Sometimes, it was precisely the kind of untraceable communication software favored by international syndicates and shadow financiers to evade federal surveillance. The file transfer completed with a soft, barely audible tone. Unplugging the flash drive, I tapped the disguised message icon. The application opened, revealing a single active thread. The sender was entirely anonymous, identified only by a random, chaotic string of alphanumeric characters. I opened the active thread and read the latest incoming message. The text was brief, brutally direct, and chillingly clear. It read, "If the old man hasn't signed the transfer papers by Friday night, we take your wife's life, and we take yours." I stared intently at the glowing screen, feeling a wave of icy clarity wash over my mind. The syndicate was dead serious. Bradley was backed into a lethal corner. He needed to eliminate me immediately to access the massive corporate funds and save his own miserable life. The stakes were laid bare, and in the quiet of that night, the truly desperate motive behind his cold betrayal was undeniably exposed right before my eyes. Dawn broke over the sprawling Los Angeles estate, bringing a deceptively serene beauty. Sunlight filtered through the heavy silk curtains of my bedroom, casting long golden shadows across the thick rug. I had sat quietly in the dark through the entire second half of the night, my mind constantly turning over the chilling reality I had uncovered on my son's tablet. The $15 million debt owed to a ruthless Miami syndicate, and the threat of death hanging over his head and his conniving wife's. Bradley wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was just a terrified, desperate boy playing a dangerous game with men who wouldn't hesitate to take his life. And to save his own skin, he was entirely willing to sacrifice me, his own father, locking me in a psychiatric ward just to steal the massive funds needed to clear his fatal debt. I slowly rose from the edge of the mattress, my muscles stiff from a night of tension. It was time to give them the exact performance they were so anxiously anticipating. Stepping into the adjoining master bathroom, I leaned close to the wide mirror to inspect my reflection. I needed to look like a man whose cognitive functions were rapidly and catastrophically collapsing. I rubbed my face hard with my hands, pulling the skin down to deepen the lines and dark circles beneath my eyes. I deliberately tousled my graying hair, leaving it unkempt and uncombed. I practiced a blank, uncomprehending stare, letting the sharp, calculating light drain completely from my eyes. Slumping, my shoulders forward, I curved my spine to mimic the heavy physical toll of late-stage debilitating dementia. With a faint metallic click, I unlocked the bedroom door and stepped into the long, silent hallway. I began my slow, painful shuffle toward the kitchen. My leather slippers dragged heavily against the polished hardwood floors, ensuring every step sounded loud, clumsy, and completely uncoordinated. As I approached the grand archway leading into the kitchen, I let out a low, confused groan, the sound of someone deeply disoriented. Bradley and Monica were already there, standing beside the massive marble island, whispering in rapid, hushed tones. The moment my dragging footsteps echoed into the room, their conversation abruptly cut short. I paused in the doorway, swaying slightly on my feet, blinking rapidly against the bright morning light as if processing it was intensely painful for my brain. Through half-closed, wandering eyes, I observed them carefully. The pure, unadulterated disgust radiating from my son was palpable. He looked at me not with the loving concern of a child watching a parent age, but with the cold, impatient annoyance of a man waiting for a stubborn obstacle to finally collapse. And Monica, ever the dedicated actress, instantly smoothed her features into a sweet, condescending mask of sympathy. "Good morning, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar, sugary poison. She hurried over, gently taking my elbow to guide my supposedly fragile frame toward a tall bar stool by the kitchen island. "Did you sleep well? You look so exhausted today." I let my head wobble loosely on my neck, my chin drooping slightly. "I don't remember," I muttered, forcing my voice to sound raspy and weak. "The walls are too bright. Everything is so confusing today. Where is Rosa? Why is the house so quiet?" "Rosa had an emergency at home, Richard." Monica lied smoothly, expertly pulling out the heavy wooden seat for me. She had to leave suddenly. "But you don't need to worry about a thing. I'm right here to take care of you. I've already made your special morning coffee." She slid a steaming ceramic mug across the smooth marble surface. I stared at the dark liquid, knowing full well what heavy, mind-altering chemicals she had crushed and stirred into that drink. As I slowly reached out to grab the warm ceramic handle, my hands began to shake with a violent, dramatic tremor. I intentionally misjudged the distance. My trembling fingers striking the side of the mug. A splash of hot coffee sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the pristine white marble counter. "Oh, careful, Richard," Monica chided gently, grabbing a linen towel to wipe up the brown stain. Her eyes flicked quickly to Bradley, sharing a triumphant, silent exchange. They believed the heavy dosage from the night before had taken full effect. They believed my mind was rapidly turning into useless, compliant mush, while Monica was distracted by the spill, and Bradley was anxiously checking the glowing screen of his expensive watch. I seamlessly slid my left hand deep into the pocket of my heavy cardigan. My fingers quickly found the small prepaid burner phone Rosa had given me in the fast food parking lot. My thumb moved expertly across the tactile keypad, relying entirely on muscle memory. Hours earlier, I had already drafted the critical text message, leaving it sitting safely in the outbox, waiting for this exact, decisive moment. The message contained only a single, highly encrypted code word. It was the absolute final authorization for Thomas Kensington, for Thomas, my cold-blooded corporate attorney, to initiate the ultimate defense protocol. This was the nuclear option. With a firm, decisive press of my thumb, I hit send. I felt the tiny vibration from the device, confirming the message had successfully transmitted across the secure cellular network. Deep inside the steel and glass fortress of his downtown law firm, Thomas was now executing a complex, impenetrable financial maneuver known as an irrevocable blind Swiss trust. With a few rapid keystrokes, Thomas was legally transferring 100% of my vast liquid assets, my massive investment portfolio, and my controlling shares in Alden Logistics completely out of my personal name. The brilliance of an irrevocable trust lies in its absolute permanence. Once this radical legal transfer was officially executed, that vast wealth was no longer my personal property. It was instantly locked behind an impenetrable wall of international banking privacy laws, managed entirely by anonymous Swiss trustees. Even I, without years of complex judicial review, could not legally touch the money. By triggering this extreme measure, I deliberately stripped myself of all worldly wealth. On paper, I made myself completely and totally broke. But more importantly, I rendered that emergency conservatorship utterly worthless. When Bradley arrived at court tomorrow morning with his forged medical documents to legally declare me incapacitated, he would win complete control over my estate just as he planned. But he would quickly discover that the legacy he was so desperate to steal was completely and thoroughly empty. He was fighting violently for the key to a bank vault that held nothing inside but dust. I let out a long, heavy sigh, resting my forehead against the cold marble of the kitchen island, continuing my pathetic performance. "I'm so tired," I whispered, letting my eyes close. "So very tired." "Just rest right there, Dad," Bradley finally spoke up, his voice tight and trembling with barely concealed anxiety. "Just close your eyes and relax. We have everything completely under control." With my eyes closed, I listened intently to the subtle, revealing sounds of the room. I could hear Bradley pacing restlessly back and forth on the hardwood floor. The irregular clicking of his heavy leather shoes betrayed the sheer, suffocating fear gripping his heart. The ruthless Miami syndicate had given him a strict, non-negotiable deadline. He had to execute a massive wire transfer today to appease the violent men threatening to murder him and his wife. I heard the distinct, soft rustle of expensive fabric as Bradley pulled his slim silver laptop from his leather briefcase. I heard the rapid, frantic tapping of his fingers as he keyed numbers into the digital pad. He was using his fraudulently obtained executive credentials to log into the main corporate banking portal. He was initiating the first crucial payment to the syndicate, $5 million. $5 million, quietly routed through a complex maze of offshore shell companies. I waited in the tense, heavy silence, my heart beating with cold, predatory anticipation. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Thomas had guaranteed the financial lockdown would be immediate and absolute. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing electronic chime shattered the quiet atmosphere of the kitchen. I slowly opened one eye, peeking out through my messy, unkempt gray hair. Bradley was staring intently at the glowing screen of his laptop. All the color drained from his face instantly, leaving his skin a sickly, alarming pale. His mouth hung slightly open, his breathing suddenly becoming rapid and shallow. He looked like a man who had just watched his own death warrant being signed. "What is it, Bradley?" Monica asked, her sweet, fake tone dropping into a sharp, worried hiss. "What's wrong with the computer?" Bradley didn't answer her. He couldn't answer her. His trembling fingers reached out, frantically tapping the trackpad in a desperate attempt to refresh the digital banking portal, trying to erase the devastating error message flashing brightly in the center of the screen. But the cold, unyielding reality of the financial lockdown refused to disappear. The massive $5 million international wire transfer had been violently rejected by the bank servers. The digital notification glowing ominously on the screen was crystal clear and absolute. The message read, "Account frozen. Access denied. Authorized signatories only. Contact legal department." The heavy, invisible trap I had spent all night building had just snapped tightly and violently around his neck. The money was completely gone. The syndicate's deadline was rapidly approaching, and my treacherous son was finally completely out of time. The unyielding strength of a father who built an empire from nothing was now bearing down on him with the relentless force of a collapsing mountain. He was entirely trapped inside the cage he had built with his own hands. Bradley sat frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking. The digital error message burned into his retinas. The absolute silence in the kitchen hung heavy, thick with the sudden realization that his perfect plan had just slammed into an impenetrable brick wall. I knew this was my only window of opportunity. While his mind was completely consumed by this sudden financial catastrophe, I let out a loud, shaky breath and deliberately let my upper body pitch heavily to the left. I reached out a trembling hand, grabbing the thick edge of the marble island to steady my intentionally clumsy movement. Monica turned her head instantly, her focus torn away from the glowing screen. She rushed forward, grabbing my shoulders to keep me from slumping onto the hardwood floor. In that brief, chaotic moment of carefully simulated distress, my right hand slid smoothly under the overhanging edge of the kitchen counter. My fingers pressed a small, magnetic audio transmitter firmly against the cold stone. Thomas had handed me the military-grade listening device right before I left his office, anticipating I would need to monitor their private conversation. The tiny device clicked silently into place, completely hidden from sight. Groaning loudly, I let my chin drop to my chest, playing the role of a heavily sedated, broken old man. Monica sighed in pure frustration, her grip on my arm tightening painfully. She barked an order at Bradley to figure out the computer issue while she took me to bed. Bradley didn't even look up. He remained completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the frozen banking portal. Monica practically dragged me down the long, dim hallway. She shoved me roughly into the master bedroom, no longer bothering with the sweet, sugary tone she had maintained earlier. The mask was slipping. Tossing a heavy blanket over my legs, she turned off the bedside lamp and walked out without a word. I heard the heavy metallic click of the door locking from the outside. The moment her footsteps faded down the hallway, I threw off the blanket and sat up in the dark. My mind was sharp, focused, and completely clear. Reaching into the inner pocket of my jacket, I pulled out the burner phone. I opened the encrypted audio app, syncing it directly with the transmitter I had just secured under the marble island. A low, rhythmic hiss of faint static emitted from the phone's speaker before the audio connection stabilized. The ambient sounds of the kitchen flooded into the quiet bedroom with crystal clarity. I adjusted the volume, holding the small device close to my ear. The audio feed captured the sound of Bradley breathing heavily, his inhalations sharp and erratic. He was hyperventilating. Monica stormed back into the kitchen, her designer heels tapping aggressively against the floor. She demanded to know what was wrong with the laptop. Bradley tried to speak, but his voice was choked with pure fear. He finally stammered out the terrifying reality of his situation, telling her the primary accounts were completely frozen. He frantically explained the concept of an irrevocable blind trust, describing how the millions they desperately needed had vanished into a legally impenetrable fortress. He was completely locked out. Monica let out a sharp, suffocating gasp. The absolute gravity of the situation finally crushed down on them. They had spent months carefully orchestrating my cognitive decline, hiring a fraudulent doctor, and preparing forged legal documents, all built on the strict assumption that the money would be waiting for them at the finish line. Now the vault was empty. The silence that followed was thick with suffocating, undeniable panic. Bradley began to fall apart completely. His voice pitched upward, trembling with pure cowardice. He started pacing frantically around the kitchen island, telling Monica they had to leave immediately. He frantically suggested they drain their personal checking accounts, pack their most expensive jewelry, and drive straight to the airport. He desperately wanted to book a private charter flight to a country completely outside federal extradition treaties, babbling about hiding in South America, changing their identities, abandoning the sprawling estate, and running for their miserable lives. He was terrified of the syndicate, well aware of the violent, relentless nature of the men who had loaned him $15 million. He wept openly, begging his wife to understand that they had no time left. If they stayed in Los Angeles, the Shadow Group would send enforcers to collect the debt in blood. His pathetic weeping echoed through the audio feed, exposing the absolute weakness of the boy I had raised. He craved the wealth and power of an empire, but possessed none of the iron willpower required to actually defend it. He was a small, fragile creature completely caught in a trap meant for apex predators. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the sound feed. The sharp, unmistakable sound of an open palm striking human skin. Bradley let out a startled, pathetic whimper. Monica had slapped him hard across the face. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely stripped of her usual sweet, high-pitched warmth. It was replaced by a low, guttural tone, trembling with an intense, unyielding rage. She told him to shut his pathetic mouth and stop acting like a frightened child. Viciously mocking his plan to run, she reminded him that the syndicate had eyes at the airports, the banks, and even in their own neighborhood. She told him that running would only guarantee their immediate demise. Monica was no coward. She was a ruthless, calculating survivor, fully prepared to cross any moral or legal boundary to save her own skin. Leaning close to the audio transmitter, her furious voice dropped to a stern, commanding whisper. She told Bradley that the only way to access the locked funds was to establish undeniable legal and physical control over me, before the trust administrators finalized the transfer agreements. She outlined a brutal new contingency plan. The forged conservatorship documents required a physical signature or biometric thumbprint to expedite the immediate release of emergency medical funds. Monica ordered Bradley to pick up his phone immediately and call Dr. Gregory Pierce. She commanded him to bring the corrupt doctor and a heavy extraction team straight to the house tonight. They were no longer going to wait until tomorrow morning. They were done playing a slow, cautious game of medical deception. They were going to force the required authorizations tonight. Bradley stammered weakly, protesting that bringing a team in the middle of the night was too risky and might alert the neighborhood's private security patrols. Monica viciously cut him off, her tone cold as ice. She snarled into the quiet kitchen, her words captured perfectly by the hidden transmitter. "If you don't get his thumbprint tonight, the syndicate will flay you alive. Bring the doctor. We're using a heavy, lethal dose." A heavy silence followed Monica's chilling command, broken only by Bradley's heavy, defeated breathing. He didn't argue. He made no attempt to defend himself or offer an alternative. He was a broken man completely consumed by the paralyzing fear of the violent men he had stupidly invited into our lives. I heard his faint, trembling murmur of compliance through the hidden transmitter. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as he hurried toward the front door. The heavy oak door groaned softly as it opened, then slammed shut, sending a faint vibration through the floorboards of my dark bedroom. A moment later, the distinct, muted roar of his sports car engine revved in the driveway. The sound of tires crunching over gravel faded into the distance as he accelerated into the Los Angeles night, rushing to retrieve the corrupt doctor and the heavy extraction team. I lay motionless on the mattress, staring up at the dark ceiling. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. Bradley was gone, but the true threat remained inside the house. Pressing the burner phone tight against my ear, I focused entirely on the ambient noise coming from the kitchen. With my son gone, the chaotic, panicked energy that had filled the room just minutes before vanished instantly. The frantic pacing stopped. The irregular, heavy breathing ceased. Monica was completely alone, and the sudden shift in her demeanor, witnessed through the audio feed, was deeply unsettling. She wasn't crying, pacing, or displaying any of the desperate, frantic anxiety that had just paralyzed her husband. Instead, I heard the slow, measured sound of heels walking toward the custom wet bar. I heard the crisp clink of ice cubes dropping into a heavy glass, followed by the smooth, steady pour of an expensive spirit. She was pouring herself a drink. She was completely and utterly relaxed. The performance was over and the mask had been discarded. I listened to her manicured nails tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the marble island. She was waiting. A few seconds later, the speaker echoed with the sounds of a distinct number being dialed. She was placing a phone call. It wasn't to Bradley, and it certainly wasn't to Dr. Gregory Pierce. The phone rang twice before a deep, resonant, impossibly cold voice answered. The man didn't offer a greeting. He simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for her to speak. "I have an update on the situation inside the estate," Monica said. Her voice had transformed beyond recognition. The sweet, melodic cadence she used to manipulate my son was completely gone, replaced by a flat, authoritative, deeply detached tone. She sounded like an experienced corporate mercenary delivering a routine briefing. The man on the other end let out a low grunt. "The deadline remains absolute," he replied, a quiet yet terrifying threat laced in his words. "Your husband failed to process the international wire transfer this afternoon. The financial accounts are completely locked down. Our employer is extremely impatient with these amateur delays. We need the 15 million immediately, or we initiate physical collection protocols. You know what that means." "I am fully aware of the current financial lockdown," Monica replied smoothly, completely unfazed by the threat of violent collection. Taking a slow, measured sip of her drink, she continued, "Bradley is a weak, incompetent fool. When the banking portal rejected the transaction, he panicked completely. He lacks the stomach for high-stakes operational failures. But you don't need to worry about the original deadline. The old man's situation is currently being neutralized. He is heavily sedated, completely incapacitated, and locked safely in the master bedroom. Bradley is currently picking up the private medical extraction team. We will force the biometric thumbprint authorization tonight. The irrevocable trust will be legally broken before sunrise, and the digital funds will be fully available for transfer tomorrow morning." A brief, calculating silence hung on the line before the syndicate enforcer let out a low grunt of approval. "That is acceptable," he finally declared. "However, the severe penalties for your husband's initial failure still apply. He embarrassed our employer and displayed severe operational weakness. We cannot overlook his complete lack of discipline. The terms of our original arrangement have fundamentally changed." "I know," Monica answered, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "And I anticipated this necessary adjustment. That is precisely why I am calling you on this secure channel. We need to finalize the secondary, operational parameters we discussed last month." I gripped the burner phone tight, my knuckles turning white in the dark. My mind raced, trying to grasp the appalling scale of the deception unfolding in my kitchen. Monica wasn't just an active accomplice in Bradley's foolish plan. She had been negotiating independently with the shadow group behind his back. Completely without his knowledge, she had reached a secret, separate arrangement with the very men threatening to murder them. "I'm listening," the enforcer replied calmly. Monica set her glass down on the marble counter. "Bradley has become a massive, unpredictable liability," she stated cold, speaking of her husband with the careless indifference of a butcher inspecting a cut of meat. "His growing paranoia and sheer cowardice will compromise the entire financial extraction. He is unstable, and if federal authorities begin investigating this massive corporate transfer, I can no longer guarantee his silence. To save his own skin, he will undoubtedly confess, and he won't hesitate to drag us both down with him. He has served his temporary purpose, but his continued existence now poses a direct threat to our mutual success." "What specifically are you proposing?" the deep voice asked. "I am proposing a permanent, mutually beneficial solution," Monica said, smoothly, without a shred of hesitation or remorse. "The biometric authorization will be completely secured tonight. The funds will be legally unfrozen from the blind trust and fully transferred to the primary accounts tomorrow morning. I will personally ensure your original $15 million debt is wired directly to your offshore holding servers without further delay. In exchange, I require you to execute Phase 2, immediately after the digital wire clears. I held my breath, feeling a deep, icy chill radiate through my veins. The woman I had welcomed into my home, whom I trusted to care for my family, was calmly requesting a professional assassination. Monica leaned close to her device, her voice dropping to a harsh, vicious whisper. Bradley is unraveling. Tomorrow, once the wire clears, eliminate him. Make it look like a suicide. I will inherit the remaining estate as the grieving widow. And your group can take an additional $10 million. I realized then that while my son was a fool, my daughter-in-law was a truly ruthless monster. I sat motionless on the edge of the mattress, the cold plastic of the burner phone pressed tight against my ear. The weight of Monica's secret call echoed through the dark, quiet bedroom. She had seamlessly orchestrated an assassination plot against her own husband, negotiating his murder with the cold, precise calculation of a corporate merger. And Bradley was completely in the dark, desperately rushing into the night to gather the medical team, utterly unaware that his beloved wife had effectively signed his death warrant. He thought he was fighting to secure a stolen fortune, but he was nothing more than a temporary pawn in her lethal game. My son was a tragic, pathetic fool. But the woman he married was a dangerous apex predator. Slowly lowering the phone, I felt the chilling reality harden my resolve into steel. There was no room left for paternal hesitation. The final lingering trace of fatherly mercy evaporated into the dark air of the master suite. It was time to turn the tables completely. Rising to my feet, I moved silently through the dark room, my mind executing tactical preparations with absolute clarity. I carefully stripped the heavy blanket and silk sheets from the mattress, folding them neatly to ensure the bed looked unmistakably empty. I didn't want them simply glancing inside. I needed them to walk all the way in, drawn deep into the trap by their own confusion. Left into the master bathroom, I left the door cracked to create deceptive shadows, positioning myself directly behind the thick, solid wood door of the main entryway. I checked the heavy brass locking mechanism, ensuring the deadbolt lined up perfectly to slide effortlessly into the reinforced frame the moment I released it. Time passed with agonizing slowness. I stood in total darkness, controlling my breathing, lowering my heart rate until my chest barely moved. The sprawling estate remained disturbingly quiet. The silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway below. As the glowing numbers on my watch jumped to 10 o'clock sharp, the low, mechanical rumble of a heavy diesel engine broke the quiet night. Moving silently to the large bay window, I concealed myself completely behind the thick velvet drapes, looking down at the long, winding driveway. A large, matte black van, crudely disguised, with generic reflective medical cross decals, rolled slowly toward the front of the house. It pulled up before the grand foyer, its engine idling with a low, threatening growl. The rear doors swung open. Bradley stepped out first, his movements stiff and trembling with nervous energy. Right behind him was Dr. Gregory Pierce, carrying a sleek black medical bag, his face set in a tight line of professional corruption. Behind the doctor emerged two broad-shouldered men, dressed in spotless medical orderly uniforms. Their rigid postures, thick necks, and cold, alert movements instantly betrayed their true profession. These were the syndicate enforcers Monica had promised. Heavy muscle sent to ensure the debt was settled in full. They were ruthless killers disguised as healthcare workers, stepping directly into my sanctuary. I watched as one of the heavy enforcers reached into the back of the black van and casually slung a heavy canvas restraint jacket over his broad shoulder. The other carried a small, specialized metal briefcase. Undoubtedly containing potent chemical, sedatives, and specialized biometric ink pads, the tools they desperately needed to force my thumbprint onto the legal conservatorship documents. They marched up the stone path with heavy, synchronized steps, their sheer physical presence radiating lethal intent. The silver buckles of the restraint jacket clinked softly in the quiet night air, a sickening lullaby marking the violent end they had planned for me. I backed away from the window, returning to my hidden position behind the heavy oak door of the master suite. Downstairs, the front door opened with a dull click. Pressing my ear against the cold wood, I listened to the distinct sounds of their intrusion. The heavy boots of the syndicate enforcers echoed loudly against the marble floor of the foyer, abandoning any pretense of medical discretion. I heard Bradley nervously whispering frantic instructions, desperately begging them to lower their voices. "Doctor," Pierce muttered about preparing a heavy dose, warning them immediately that the chemical mixture had to be administered the very second they secured my limbs. They began a slow, ominous ascent up the grand spiral staircase. Under the heavy combined weight of the squad, the wooden steps groaned loudly in protest. I tracked their steady progress with flawless precision, matching the sounds of their boots to the exact layout of the spacious second-floor hallway. Reaching the top landing, they paused. A heavy, suffocating tension immediately filled the air right outside my bedroom. I heard Bradley shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He whispered to the doctor, asking if the massive sedative dose would permanently damage my heart. The enforcer growled low at my son, ordering him to shut his mouth and open the door. The undisguised contempt in his voice perfectly mirrored Monica's earlier anger. I heard the sharp scrape of metal as the key slipped clumsily into the brass lock. Bradley's hands were trembling so badly he could barely operate the simple mechanism. Finally, the deadbolt clicked back. The brass handle turned slowly. Whining softly in the dead silence, the heavy oak door was pushed gently inward, revealing the dark space of the master suite. Bradley carefully stepped over the threshold, his breathing heavy and shallow. The doctor and the two broad-shouldered men pressed closely behind him, their width nearly filling the massive doorway. Clustered tightly together, they paused, staring into the darkness. Bradley reached out and flipped the wall switch. Harsh overhead light flooded the room, and he let out a sharp, confused gasp. His eyes darted frantically across the wide space, scanning the stripped mattress, the empty armchair, and the bare corners. He froze completely, his mind unable to process the contrast between his expectations and the reality before him. The meticulously planned extraction was ruined. The bed was completely empty. Before his panicked mind could form a word of warning, I stepped smoothly out from the deep shadows directly behind them. Grasping the heavy brass handles on the double oak doors, I pulled them shut with every ounce of strength I had. The heavy wood slammed closed, striking the reinforced frame with a thunderous impact. I immediately threw my weight against the door, forcefully turning the solid brass interior deadbolt. With a sharp click, they were completely locked inside the master suite. The heavy oak doors vibrated violently on their brass hinges as the trapped men began slamming their weight against the wood. Muffled shouts of confusion and sheer panic echoed within the space. Bradley shrieked frantically, his voice breaking in terror as he realized they were trapped. I didn't linger. Turning my back on their frantic struggles, I walked with a steady pace down the upper hallway toward my private, secure study. The frail, broken old man they so desperately wanted to exploit was completely gone. Stepping into the dark study, I calmly poured a glass of aged scotch into a heavy crystal tumbler. Grasping the thick armrests of my favorite leather armchair, I deliberately dragged the heavy piece of furniture out of the room, positioning it right in the center of the upper landing. The chair faced the violently shaking doors. Sitting down into the plush leather, I crossed my legs and took a slow, deliberate sip of the smoky liquid. The heavy blows against the oak doors grew louder, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. With one final explosive kick, the solid brass deadbolt tore through the frame. The heavy doors burst outward, slamming hard against the hallway walls. 4 men stumbled out from the darkness of the master suite, their faces flushed with adrenaline. The moment their heavy boots hit the polished floorboards of the landing, I reached over and flipped the main wall switch. The chandeliers lining the long hallway burst to life, flooding the upper level of the estate in brilliant, glaring light. The sudden brightness hit them like a physical blow. They froze in place, shielding their eyes, completely paralyzed in absolute shock. I sat before them, holding my crystal glass, radiating the sharp, cold authority of the executive they had foolishly tried to overthrow. I looked sharper and colder than I had in 20 years. Bradley stumbled back, blinking rapidly, entirely unable to process the terrifying sight of his father sitting calmly in that chair. In his expensive suit, he looked small, exuding the pathetic, frightened energy of a defeated child. Dr. Gregory Pierce was the first to break the suffocating silence, desperately trying to salvage his clinical pretense. Adjusting his rumpled suit jacket, his right hand tightly gripped the thick plastic barrel of a large syringe. He took a slow, cautious step forward, offering a tight, artificial smile of professional medical concern. "Richard," he said, his voice smooth and deceptively calm, "you are experiencing severe cognitive disorientation. You need to return to bed immediately. Please let me administer a mild sedative to help you." I didn't flinch. Not a single muscle in my face moved. Taking another slow, satisfying sip of scotch, I locked my cold gaze directly onto the doctor. "Dr. Pierce," I replied, my voice echoing with firm authority, "if you take one more step toward me with that syringe, I guarantee you will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a high-security federal prison. Your fraudulent medical evaluations have already been secured and transmitted directly to my legal counsel." The doctor stopped dead in his tracks, the fake smile sliding completely from his face. The 2 broad-shouldered men shifted uneasily, exchanging anxious looks. They had been promised a smooth extraction of a helpless, incapacitated old man. They were entirely unprepared to face a fully coherent billionaire actively defending his stronghold. The larger man glared hard at Bradley, his deep voice rumbling with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "You guaranteed our employer that your father was completely incapacitated tonight." Bradley finally found his voice, though it was high-pitched and trembling with pure terror. "Dad," he stammered, stepping nervously behind the broad shoulder of the man beside him. "Please, you have to understand. I had no choice. They froze the banking portals. I couldn't access the funds. You have to sign the emergency conservatorship documents now. You have to let the doctor take your thumbprint. If you don't give them the money tonight, they won't hesitate to eliminate Monica and me." I stared at my sweating, trembling son with profound disgust. I had spent a lifetime building an impenetrable shield to protect my family from the harsh realities of the world. Yet this pathetic creature had eagerly traded that vital protection for a fleeting illusion of power. "Bradley," I said, my tone devoid of any fatherly warmth. The primary financial accounts weren't frozen because of a simple banking error. I personally initiated an irrevocable blind trust. Every single penny you tried to steal is completely and permanently untouchable. The devastating words hit the small group like a physical shockwave. The men immediately realized the massive financial reward was off the table. Their aggressive stance instantly shifted away from me, focusing entirely on my son. Bradley let out a sharp gasp, shrinking back against the wall. As the two men turned their angry gazes onto him, he was completely out of time, stripped of all leverage, and surrounded by hostile forces. Yet, the true depth of his nightmare was just beginning. He began to weep openly, begging for more time, promising he could still find a way to access the missing corporate millions. Pleading for his life, he desperately brought up his wife's name, claiming Monica would figure out a brilliant solution to save them both. Reaching smoothly into my jacket pocket, I pulled out the sleek black remote control that operated the estate's integrated smart home automation system. Setting my thumb lightly on the main play button, I locked eyes with my son. "I don't think your lovely wife is going to be of any help to you tonight," I stated cold. I pressed the button. Instantly, the crystal clear, amplified audio recording of Monica secretly betraying Bradley blasted through the hidden surround sound speakers lining the hallway ceiling. Her calculating voice echoed coldly around us, outlining a plan for his immediate elimination and intending to inherit the remaining fortune as a grieving widow. The audio clip ended, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Bradley stood completely paralyzed as his world shattered into dust. Turning his head, he stared in pure terror toward the empty staircase. The echo of Monica's voice faded into the architecture of the upper landing, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence. Bradley slowly turned his head back, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He looked like a man whose soul had just been torn from his body. His absolute belief in his wife's devotion, the foundational pillar of his betrayal, had just been revealed as a fatal illusion. He had destroyed his relationship with his father, ruined his career, and pledged his life to dangerous lenders, all for a woman who was actively plotting his end. Before Bradley could speak, the sharp, frantic clicking of designer heels echoed rapidly up the stairs. Monica rushed onto the upper landing, her face flushed and her breathing rapid. The sound of her private conversation, playing over the house audio system pseudo, had drawn her up from the kitchen in a panic. The moment she reached the top of the stairs, she stopped dead. Her terrified eyes scanned the shattered remnants of the master suite doors, the two enforcers, her weeping husband, and finally landed on me. I sat calmly in the high-backed chairs, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, watching her carefully constructed world collapse. Monica opened her mouth, desperately searching for a lie to explain the audio recording, but no words came. Bradley stared at her with a sickening mix of deep grief and boiling hatred. He took a faltering step toward her, his hands clenched into trembling fists. He finally understood that in Monica's relentless pursuit of wealth, he was nothing more than a disposable stepping stone. However, the larger of the two men had zero interest in witnessing a collapsing marital dispute. The dramatic revelation held no relevance to his primary objective. Scent. to collect a massive debt he had just learned. The primary financial accounts were completely locked. The path to quietly transferring corporate funds through an emergency conservatorship was dead. The planned extraction had failed. The muscular enforcer let out a low, guttural growl of pure frustration. Raising a large hand, he violently ripped the medical mask from his face, tossing it carelessly onto the polished floorboards. The pretense of being healthcare professionals was officially over. Turning his imposing frame completely toward me, his dark eyes narrowed into cold slits. He took 2 heavy, deliberate steps, closing the physical distance between us. His right hand slid smoothly beneath his spotless medical uniform. When his hand emerged a fraction of a second later, the atmosphere in the hallway instantly shifted from tense negotiation to lethal danger. He gripped a heavy, matte black, semi-automatic handgun. A long cylindrical suppressor was screwed tightly onto the barrel, converting the weapon into an efficient tool. With practiced precision, he raised the firearm, pointing the dark, hollow barrel directly at the center of my chest. Unyielding reality flooded the entire upper landing. "Doctor." Gregory Pierce let out a sharp, pathetic shriek of terror. The corrupt doctor stumbled backward, dropping his medical bag and the syringe onto the floor. Raising his trembling hands, all color drained from his face. He had eagerly signed up for a lucrative, fraudulent medical scheme, believing he would administer a sedative and walk away with a massive payout. He had never agreed to participate in an armed execution. Pressing his back tight against the hallway wall, he was paralyzed by the sudden appearance of the suppressed weapon. The enforcer ignored the whimpering doctor. His dark, emotionless eyes remained locked onto me. "Listen very carefully, old man," he rumbled softly, his voice echoing with lethal authority. "The quiet legal path is officially dead. Your idiot son and his conniving wife have severely complicated our business. But our employer never walks away without getting paid. Stand up, walk to your study, and open your wall safe. Hand over every ounce of cash, every bearer bond, and every piece of jewelry. Then call your attorney and authorize the reversal of the trust agreement." He stepped closer, the metal tip of the suppressor hovering less than 3 feet from my heart. "If you refuse," he continued, without a trace of sympathy, "I'll put a hole in your right knee. If you still refuse, I'll shatter your left knee. I will systematically dismantle you until you hand over the access codes. When I'm done with you, I will eliminate your son, his wife, and the doctor, leaving this entire estate behind." I sat motionless, maintaining a relaxed posture in the armchair. I didn't break eye contact with the enforcer. Taking one last, slow, satisfying sip of scotch, I felt the warm, smoky liquid slide down my throat. I set the glass down. "You clearly don't understand the mechanics of an irrevocable blind trust," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of fear. "The entire purpose of such a financial instrument is to remove all authorial control from the original owner. I am completely locked out of my own accounts. Even if I desperately wanted to reverse the transfer, I couldn't. And my private safe contains nothing but sentimental family photos and old tax documents. There is absolutely nothing in this house for you to take." The enforcer sneered, his finger tightening noticeably on the metal trigger. He clearly didn't believe me, or he simply didn't care about the complex logistical realities of Swiss banking laws. "Then, let's start with the knees," he growled, preparing to pull the trigger. However, before he could fire, the thunderous, explosive roar of shattering glass interrupted the confrontation. The massive architectural windows lining the grand staircase exploded inward with a spectacular crash. Thousands of sharp glass fragments rained down onto the polished floorboards, glittering under the golden lights. The sudden, violent breach sent a massive shockwave of displaced air through the upper landing. The enforcer flinched instinctively, his finger pausing briefly on the trigger as chaotic noise filled the estate. Through the gaping hole in the heavy glass, cutting through the swirling dust and falling debris, bright red laser aiming lines suddenly pierced the darkness. The vivid red beams swept into the hallway, moving with terrifying military precision. The laser sights instantly locked onto their designated targets. A glowing red dot landed perfectly on the lead enforcer's chest. A second beam targeted the forehead of the other man. A third laser illuminated Dr. Gregory Pierce's trembling chest, while a fourth steady red dot rested directly over Monica's heart. The bright red laser points held perfectly steady, painting lethal targets directly over the hearts of the intruders standing on landing. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The armed enforcer, a man who had undoubtedly orchestrated countless acts of violence, looked down at the stark red dot glowing in the center of his white uniform. The supreme confidence behind his lethal threats vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, paralyzing realization. He had walked blindly into a highly coordinated, inescapable federal trap. Before the enforcer's finger could twitch on the trigger, the estate's heavy, custom-reinforced front door was violently blasted off its hinges. A deafening, explosive shockwave shook the house's foundation, followed by the overwhelming, chaotic shouts of heavily armed tactical agents flooding the grand foyer. Blinding tactical flashlight beams cut through the swirling dust downstairs. The authoritative voices of federal agents echoed rapidly up the staircase, shouting absolute commands that left no room for negotiation or resistance. Agents, drop your weapons immediately. Put your hands where we can see them. Do it now. The sheer scale of the breach was spectacular. Dozens of agents in body armor swarmed up the grand staircase, their rifles raised and aimed at the helpless group gathered on the landing. Calculating his slim chances of survival in a fraction of a second, the lead enforcer made the only logical decision. Slowly opening his large fingers, he let the heavy, suppressed handgun slide from his grip. The weapon clattered loudly against the polished floorboards, sliding harmlessly toward the wooden railing. Slowly raising his hands high into the air, he completely surrendered his authority to the overwhelming force. Tactical agents descended upon them with efficient precision. 3 heavily armed men tackled the lead enforcer, slamming him face down onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. They violently twisted his arms behind his back, securing his wrists with thick plastic zip ties. The second man offered no physical resistance. Dropping to his knees immediately, he interlaced his fingers tightly behind his head. Agents quickly surrounded him, thoroughly searching for hidden weapons before binding his hands. Dr. Gregory Pierce, watching his lucrative medical scheme collapse into a federal nightmare, let out a pathetic, high-pitched shriek of panic. Waving his hands frantically, his head shook side to side. "I am a licensed medical professional," he stammered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "I was only hired to conduct a standard psychiatric evaluation. I have nothing to do with these violent men. You can't arrest me." A tall federal agent completely ignored the corrupt doctor's desperate pleas. Stepping forward swiftly, the agent grabbed the lapels of the doctor's suit jacket, slamming him hard against the decorative wallpaper. The impact knocked what little air remained right out of the doctor's lungs. The agent kicked his legs apart, forcing him into a vulnerable stance, thoroughly searching his pockets before clapping heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his trembling wrists. The medical bag containing the lethal sedatives was immediately seized and secured as primary evidence. As the chaotic control over the active threat came to an end, a familiar figure walked calmly up the grand staircase. Thomas Kensington ascended the wooden steps with an unhurried pace, looking like a man taking an evening stroll. Dressed in an immaculate charcoal gray suit, he held a thick manila folder in his left hand. Walking past the groaning enforcers and the weeping doctor, he stopped directly before my armchair. Offering me a brief, respectful nod, he turned his sharp, calculating gaze entirely onto my treacherous daughter-in-law. Monica had remained completely silent during the breach, her mind undoubtedly racing to devise a miraculous escape route. Realizing escape was physically impossible, she immediately resorted to the only weapon she had left. Collapsing dramatically to her knees, she buried her face in her hands and began to weep with theatrical sorrow. She looked up at Thomas, her wide eyes filled with manufactured tears. "Thank God you're here," she sobbed, her voice trembling with fake relief. These horrible, violent men broke into the house. They forced Bradley to bring them here. They were going to eliminate Richard. I tried to stop them. You have to believe me. I was just trying to protect my family. Thomas looked down at her with profound, unyielding disgust. He didn't say a word. Unclasping the thick manila folder, he pulled out a stack of legally bound documents, holding up the first page to display it clearly under the chandelier light. "This is a certified, expedited toxicology report from the primary medical lab," Thomas stated, his voice echoing coldly across the quiet landing. "It conclusively proves the presence of lethal, unauthorized, chemical sedatives in Richard's bloodstream, matching the exact haloperidol compound recovered from your private kitchen. Furthermore," he continued, pulling out a second document stamped with a federal judge's seal, "this is a classified federal wiretap warrant. Authorities have been actively monitoring your private communications over the past 72 hours. We have crystal clear, indisputable audio recordings proving you independently negotiated a ruthless contract for hire with the Miami group." Monica's dramatic sobbing stopped instantly. The sweet, innocent mask shattered completely, exposing the cold, calculating predator beneath. As two female federal agents stepped forward, pulling her up from the floor and securing handcuffs tightly around her wrists, she glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She didn't utter another word as she was escorted down the stairs. Bradley was the only one left standing intact. Completely surrounded by armed agents, he was utterly ignored. A man deemed insignificant. He looked around the hallway, watching. His dangerous wife, his corrupt doctor, and his lethal enforcers being dragged into the night. The crushing reality of his situation settled heavily on his narrow shoulders. The vast wealth was gone, his marriage was a deadly lie, and his entire life was officially over. He sank heavily onto the lowest steps of the upper landing, completely unable to take another step. Looking up at me, tears streamed down his pale, sweat-stained face, his body trembling violently. "Dad," he sobbed, begging his father to save him from federal prison. "Please help me." I took my first step down the grand staircase, looking down at my kneeling son. I moved with measured grace, like a ruler inspecting the ruined aftermath of a conquered rebellion. The heavy noise of the tactical raid was fading, replaced by the stern voices of agents processing the prisoners. Flashing red and blue lights from the armored fleet parked in my driveway cast long, irregular shadows through the broken frame of the front window. I took another step down, my eyes fixed on the pathetic, trembling figure I had raised. Bradley remained collapsed on the floor, his expensive suit covered in drywall, dust, and shattered glass. His shoulders heaved with uncontrollable sobs as his hands reached into the air, grasping at a lifeline that was long gone. Reaching the bottom landing, I stopped inches from his trembling body, towering over him with a straight posture that radiated absolute, cold detachment. He slowly raised his head, his face a grotesque mask of sweat and pure fear. The arrogant boy who had eagerly plotted to strip away my freedom was completely gone. In his place was a hollow, broken creature who finally understood the catastrophic consequences of his foolish actions. "Dad, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate plea. "You have to stop them. You have to tell Thomas to withdraw the charges. I can't go to federal prison. I won't survive in a place like that. You know I'm not a criminal. I was manipulated. Monica pushed me into this corner. She fed poison to my mind, turning me against you, making me believe you were losing your memory. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, you have the best corporate defense lawyers in the country on your payroll. You can afford to fix this. Just release a small amount from the trust and hire a legal team for me. I'll do whatever you want. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Just don't let them lock me away in a concrete cage." His words spilled out in a frantic rush, a waterfall of transparent lies and cowardly excuses. He was willing to throw his wife under the bus, trying to rewrite history, to paint himself as a tragic victim. He reached out, a trembling hand, trying to grab my trousers. I deliberately took a step back, rejecting his touch with deep disgust. Looking down at the weeping man, the finality of my decision hardened in my chest, like cooling steel. You fundamentally lack the capacity to take responsibility for your own actions. "Bradley," I stated, my voice carrying a cold authority that cut cleanly through his pathetic sobs. "You stand here, surrounded by armed federal agents, and your first instinct is to beg me to buy your redemption. You eagerly conspired with a corrupt doctor to poison my blood. You brought lethal enforcers into the sanctuary of my home. You tried to steal $15 million from the fortune I spent 40 years building with my sweat and blood. You did all of this out of pure, unadulterated greed. And the reason you failed completely is that you possess none of the iron willpower required to be a predator. You sold out your own blood for a woman who was actively planning your funeral. Bradley, while you were rushing out to collect her enforcers, she was negotiating the price of your assassination. If I magically drop these federal charges tonight, those enforcers would eliminate you before the sun crosses the horizon. They would take your life for losing their money. Federal prison is the only place on this earth where they can't touch you. I'm not just sending you to a cell. I am quite literally saving your miserable life. But you will serve your time without a single penny of my corporate wealth. I will not fund your defense, nor will I pay for your legal team. When you finally walk out of that cage one day, you will no longer bear my name. You have been completely disowned, stripped of your privilege, and removed from your legacy. You are no longer an Alden. The absolute finality of my judgment hit him like a physical blow. Bradley let out a hollow wail, slumping forward until his forehead rested against the dusty floorboards, his body twitching under the weight of complete ruin. A sudden, sharp, and toxic laugh shattered the heavy air of the foyer. I shifted my gaze slightly. 2 federal agents were forcibly dragging Monica toward the shattered front entrance. The moment she realized her performance was useless, she stopped her dramatic weeping. She had heard my entire speech, digesting the catastrophic reality of her own impending ruin. The wiretap warrant and the undeniable toxicology report guaranteed she would face at least 20 years in a maximum security federal prison for conspiracy and attempted murder. The sweet, impeccably polished daughter-in-law was completely gone, replaced by a snarling, vicious creature backed into a corner by the inescapable consequences of her own endless greed. She twisted her neck, glaring at me with cold eyes that lacked any human warmth. "You miserable, heartless old bastard," she spat, her voice dripping with pure, venomous hatred. "You think you won. You think you're so smart, sitting on that pathetic throne. You are going to die all alone in this massive, completely empty mausoleum. Your once great legacy is dead and buried. Your son is a pathetic coward, and your precious empire will turn to dust." She bared her teeth, looking like a wild, trapped animal completely consumed by her own toxic malice. The federal agents offered no tolerance for her outburst. They yanked her forward, shoving her roughly through the ruined doorway into the flashing lights of the waiting transport vehicles. Her vicious curses dissolved into the chaotic noise, leaving behind a profound, cleansing silence in her wake. I stood perfectly still in the center of the destroyed foyer, watching the tactical squad process the final remnants of the shattered conspiracy. Thomas Kensington stepped quietly to my side, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the tactical body armor of the agents swarming the property. Tucking the thick manila folder securely under his arm, his sharp eyes scanned the scene of absolute destruction and legal victory. The operation was executed flawlessly. "Richard," Thomas whispered, maintaining his usual detached calm. "The primary syndicate enforcers are in federal custody. The corrupt doctor is already actively bargaining for a plea deal. And the localized threat to your personal safety has been completely neutralized." I nodded slowly, letting my gaze fall one last time on my broken son kneeling on the floor. 2 tall agents stepped forward, gripping Bradley's shoulders and pulling him roughly to his feet. He offered no resistance. He slumped lifelessly in their strong grip, his eyes hollow, staring blankly into the distance. A man whose entire universe had been wiped out. I watched them escort him out the door, without a single trace of lingering emotion. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past few months, the endless paranoia and bitter deception, finally evaporated into the cool night air. The brutal conflict was officially over. Turning my back on the shattered glass, I walked, slowly, back toward the grand staircase. A full month had passed since that chaotic night of federal intervention. The massive, broken windows in the grand foyer had been completely replaced with reinforced glass, and the heavy oak doors of the master suite were fully rebuilt. The physical scars on the estate had been carefully erased. But the deep silence that now filled the sprawling house was the most significant change of all. It was a peaceful, unburdened silence. I sat comfortably behind the polished mahogany desk in my private study. Bright, morning light streaming through the wide bay windows, casting a warm golden glow across the room. The legal proceedings moved swiftly and with absolute, cold precision. My corporate attorneys acted with surgical accuracy, executing a complete, irrevocable severing of all family ties with Bradley. Bradley was no longer a recognized member of our family. He had been completely disowned, stripped of his inheritance, removed from every trust fund, and permanently barred from the logistics empire I spent my life building. As far as I knew, he was currently in federal custody awaiting trial, entirely dependent on a heavily overworked public defender. I didn't track his daily progress, nor did I send letters. I had completely cut that treacherous growth out of my life. The only person who showed unwavering loyalty throughout my simulated decline was Rosa. Yesterday afternoon, I called her into my office. She stood nervously before my desk, hands clasped tightly, perhaps fearing she was about to be let go. Instead, I handed her a thick, legally binding contract and a small velvet box. I officially promoted her to the prestigious position of head estate manager, permanently doubled her salary, and awarded her a substantial cash bonus for her unwavering devotion. Inside the velvet box was a fresh set of keys to a brand new luxury vehicle parked right in the driveway. She wept, but those were tears of genuine gratitude, a stark contrast to the vicious sobbing of my former daughter-in-law. Leaning back in my heavy leather executive chair, I took a slow, savoring sip of black coffee from a porcelain cup. It was a clean, pure cup of coffee, entirely free of the chalky, bitter chemical sedatives Monica had so cold-bloodedly mixed into my daily routine. That uncompromising, clean taste was nothing short of wonderful. I turned my attention back to the thick stack of corporate logistics contracts sitting securely on my desk. The international supply chain empire was thriving, completely untouched by Bradley's foolish, desperate attempt to drain its lifeblood for a violent syndicate. Over the past 4 weeks, stock valuations had surged, solidifying our absolute dominance in the global market. I had certainly suffered a massive emotional blow. A father should never be forced to watch his only son willingly walk into the arms of predators out of pure greed. I spent decades building an impenetrable fortress around him, protecting him from the harsh realities of the world, only to discover he was eager to invite the wolves inside. He mistook my quiet aging for weakness. He mistook my paternal patience for cognitive decline. He fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of the man who created his luxurious reality, assuming I was merely a relic ready to be discarded. But the empire stood tall, far stronger than before. The treacherous elements had been thoroughly rooted out, swept away by the precise, overwhelming power of the federal government and my own uncompromising resolve. I am an old man, but my mind remains razor-sharp, my vision absolute and clear. My iron grip on my legacy is firmer now than at any point in my life. I survived the darkest betrayal a father could face and emerged in complete victory. I no longer needed to look back, nor did I have to play the role of a broken, heavily sedated victim. The grand stage had been cleared of its worst actors. The wolves came for the old man. The wolves came for the old man, but they completely forgot that he was the apex predator who built the entire forest. They came searching for an easy meal, only to find a man fully prepared to burn down his own bloodline to protect the empire he built with his bare hands. The house is finally quiet, perfectly secure, and completely under my absolute control. My legacy will endure, untouched by the greedy hands of those who thought they could take what they never earned. Looking out the window at the vast estate, I felt a deep, echoing satisfaction settle into my bones. The storm had officially passed, leaving only strength behind. I am Richard Alden, and I will never be anyone's victim again. Family is often portrayed as an unbreakable bond, but blood does not guarantee loyalty, and age does not equal weakness. The greatest mistake a predator can make is assuming a quiet old man has lost his teeth. Greed blinds people, preventing them from seeing where the true foundation of an empire lies. Real power doesn't come from manipulation or deceit. It comes from decades of hard-earned wisdom, patience, and the ability to strike with absolute precision when the time is right. Trust your instincts, protect everything you have built, and never let anyone mistake your kindness for stupidity. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button to support the channel. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling content.